Time to say a very good day to Ms. Helen Dale. Helen, how the hell are you?
Oh, I'm not too bad. It was sunny earlier, but the sun's now disappeared momentarily.
Ah,
So,
well, no doubt. We will see some form of a summer at some point or other. We had a couple of days in June, but sadly May was pretty bad. Of course, Wimbledon week is on, so it normally rains anyway.
yeah, it's like they offend the tennis gods or something.
Yes.
So the heavens open. Yes.
Yes, exactly right. Now, tell me. I know that it's not the obvious thing to do to come and talk to you because you happen to be Australian, but you obviously know more about Australia than we do. What's going on, and why have they only vaccinated 7% of their population? Because quite a lot of vaccine hesitancy, I think.
Yeah, there are a number of issues going on at the moment. Initially, Australia's vaccine rollout was delayed by 2 months because of export controls imposed by the European Union. So they were put behind. And that was widely reported over here. So they were put behind from the get-go. Then you've got the situation where, once again, this started in the European Union, but it's gone everywhere else as well, whereby the AstraZeneca vaccine has been undermined, basically, and that started in the EU over these rare blood clots. And yes, doctors and nurses have been pointing out that it's less of a risk to you, much less of a risk in terms of blood clots than, say, taking the oral contraceptive or certain kinds of medications for erectile dysfunction, which can also produce either blood clots or just basically blowing a fuse.
Yeah.
I won't go any further there. Then you've got the situation where if you directly compare, and this is a problem, a lot of people don't understand absolute and relative risk. For someone who's under 30, I think the figure is, the risk, if you only compare the vaccine to COVID and to nothing else, so you exclude any side thinking about, say, the oral contraceptive or Viagra, you then have a situation where it is actually of more risk to have the AstraZeneca vaccine than it is to just catch COVID, because young people under 30, if anything, they get a sniffle, but huge numbers of people get nothing at all. And I've got a personal friend up in Scotland who got it, who showed the antibodies and then did a blood test to confirm it. And he has no idea when he had COVID. He was one of those asymptomatic people.
Yeah, but also, Helen, this is not just something that's being said on, Facebook, or not something that's being said in various kind of social media communities. This is the sort of thing that's being said and has been said in Europe as well by senior health officials in France, in Germany, and now in Australia.
The state in Australia is that's responsible for this, and both the Premier, who I went to university with, I remember her from her student union days, and the Chief Medical Officer of the state of Queensland are in a lot of strife at the moment and are being accused by the other chief medical officers and state premiers, and I understand also the Prime Minister, for promoting an anti-vax message, because the Prime Minister, Australia's got plenty of vaccines now. That supply problem has finally been dealt with. But it did take a very long time because Australia had to source them from elsewhere, vaccinate New Guinea, because some of the initial stocks from the EU were meant to be for PNG as well. That's the other issue that people aren't aware of, and also some of New Zealand. So what has happened now is that the Chief Medical Officer in Queensland came out and just made a blanket statement that nobody under 40 should get the AstraZeneca vaccine after the federal government, this is the Commonwealth, remember, federal system, so it's like the US, you're going to get differences from state to state, had said anyone who wants the AstraZeneca vaccine can go to their GP and get it, but they should have a chat with their GP first. So it was left up to the individual. And it was an attempt by the Morrison government to be a little bit less authoritarian, because Australia is such an authoritarian country. And so what has happened now is that all the other state premiers and the national government have turned on Queensland and said, thanks for promoting anti-vax. Because one of the effects, and I've discussed this previously on the Independent Republic, with authoritarianism in any area, whether it's vaping or cannabis or vaccinations, is if you constantly step on people to get what you want, the government in this case, or it can be a large institution, a large company, then you finish up with people going, what are you hiding?
Yeah.
And that's how the conspiracy
But that's the
theories
trouble.
start.
I mean, it feeds into all of that because, I mean, the thing that I was shocked to hear this morning on an interview with somebody from Independent Sage, and this was on the subject of whether or not children should be vaccinated. The Independent Sage argument is, well, it's a question of whether you wish to operate on behalf of the population or you wish to operate on behalf of your family. Basically saying to parents, well, you're really not a very good person if you don't get your child vaccinated. And that, to me, is not only morally wrong, it's ethically inept, and it's just ridiculous.
It also doesn't work. It increases vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
Where you see these anti-vax arguments circulating, particularly as we now know that this is not the issue in Australia. The people who tend not to get vaccinated in Australia aren't the religious or the poor. It's a different issue. It's an upper middle class phenomenon. The hippies who live in Byron Bay. I mean, there was some quite alarming reports a few years ago that some of the most under-vaccinated people were not where you expected, like remote Aboriginal communities. Aborigines are pretty good at making sure they rock up and all their kids get their vaccines.
Right.
It was actually amongst upper middle class people who really do have quite a lot of money, and it was tied in with environmentalism and ecology, and but the cod side of ecology.
They didn't like the chemicals or something.
Yeah. You would get all these extraordinary stories about mercury being in vaccines, and or that it was coming from alien fetuses, and they were really quite insane. So anti-vax in Australia doesn't have religious roots like it does in parts of the United States and like it does here.
Yes. But of course, the other problem here, Helen, is, and it sounds as though it's happening in Australia as well, an awful lot of people who are hesitant about taking the vaccine are hesitant because they don't know absolutely whether it's going to be safe for them. And it's got nothing to do with them being anti-vax. It's got everything to do with them just being concerned for their own health. And particularly if,
you've got these confusing messages. You've got a reasonably well-credentialed, medic in Queensland saying one thing, and then you've got other equally well-credentialed in other states saying another thing. Right. Then you've got a Quango, a Targi, giving advice, and then you've got the government, the federal government, putting its own spin on this.
On all of it,
and on all of it. Now, I'm going to make one observation here. A lot of people recommend federalism as a government system. I've seen it being touted as a solution to the problem of the endless campaigns for Scottish independence. Yeah. I'd like to add a note of caution on this as someone, I can do that as a person who grew up in a federal system, but also grew up in a particular state. I grew up in Queensland, which has always been very authoritarian. It's always had this weakness. I mean, it was very, very bad when I was in high school. The running joke was if you got 3 Queenslanders together, they'd be arrested because basically public protest was illegal. It was like a developing country. Yeah. But federalism requires very high state capacity. If you want to look at badly run federalism, look at the United States. Yeah. If you want to look at well-run federalism, look at Australia. And even in Australia, it's struggling to get the vaccines to be rolled out effectively across the country.
Yeah, I would say another bad example of it is the European Union, because although it's not technically a federal system, it kind of is. And the EU would love it to be a federal system.
And
where you see Angela Merkel this week trying to sort of put pressure on all the European countries in the EU not to accept Britain's going on holiday there.
And the other thing is the enormous mess of the European Union vaccine rollout, which is an ongoing mess. They've still got problems, has its roots in the misapplication of federalism. Those European countries with good healthcare systems, particularly Germany, were doing very, very well until they decided to hand the vaccine rollout, bump it upstairs. This is a very common thing. Britain used to do this when we were a member of the EU as well. And then when it went wrong, blame the EU body for doing it rather than for stuffing it up rather than attempting to do it themselves. But yet federalism is really, really hard to do well, and confronted with a pandemic, even probably the best run federal system in the world, which is Australia's, is really, really struggling. And in the context, if you disaggregate the 4 home nations, you can see the one that is struggling now with its vaccine rollout relative to the rest of the UK is Scotland, because Scotland has taken the most into its own hands, whereas Wales and Northern Ireland and England have tended to act in concert with the vaccine rollout.
Right.
So
what about the other question I was asking earlier on is, if lockdown has been in place pretty much for an awful lot of the time that Australia has been under these sort of situations and since the first outbreak, really, why is it that it still has COVID? Because people have not been arriving into Australia in mass numbers. Hardly anyone's visiting there. People might be moving around inside the country, but if they've got rid of it, how come it's still there?
Well, Australia hasn't had, apart from the state of Victoria, which had quite a lot because it really did have problems with its quarantine, Australia's actually had very few lockdowns. What they did was they worked on the principle of close the borders but let the economy in the country continue to function normally.
Right.
What they found with this Indian variant, or Delta variant as they're insisting on calling it, but I think the geographical location is as good as any. We all know where Kent and India are. Stop it. Is that it's much more transmissible. And certainly the New South Wales outbreak, it emerged as a result of a driver from one of the airports, I think Kingsford Smith in Sydney, who was being used to ferry travel crew, international air crew, from the domestic to the international terminals. And he wasn't vaccinated, and at no point did he wear a mask. And he got this highly transmissible variant, supposedly 60% more transmissible, and became a super spreader. So that was that's one thing Australia's very good at is the test and trace. So they've established patient zero with that, and that's how it started. But the problem is now Australia thought that its very effective quarantine hadn't been breached. So the entire rest of the country, even Victoria by this stage, had been completely unlocked. The economy was operating normally, steaming out of the recession very quickly, as Australia always does. It's got a very robust economy. And they didn't realise that this super spreader was basically running around New South Wales, giving the most transmissible variant to everybody he came in contact with.
Right. But then, of course, the question once again becomes, but that's okay, that will happen. It's almost impossible to stop that from happening here and there. The question is, how deadly is it? And if it's not deadly, then just get on with it, surely.
Well, and once again, we don't know. I looked on the Australian's website. That's the newspaper that I write for in Australia, and they've got rolling
I've had things published in the Australian. I'll have you know, Ms. Dale.
Sorry?
I said I've had things published in the Australian.
Have you really? Yes, I know.
They used to nick the stuff I did for the Sunday Times and not pay me.
Yes. Oh, they're supposed to pay you a repro,
I know.
Or at least pay your paper.
They paid the paper.
The paper.
Yes,
didn't pay you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But the Australian's got a rolling update, and I had a look at it this morning, and my understanding based on that, although of course I've been sitting here for 15 minutes talking to you and also looking at the Britney Spears story, and I don't think anyone in Australia has died of the Indian or Delta variant.
No.
Basically, I'm not even sure if anyone's been hospitalised, but I think there are a couple.
Which is interesting because because their vaccination rate is so low. You would have expected some of that to happen, but I don't think it is. Stay with us though for a second, because we're just going to stop for a moment. We're talking to Helen Dale because we're going to come back and talk about Britney Spears and the very weird and strange story where her father, despite the fact that she is a grown woman, perfectly capable, perfectly healthy, perfectly mentally stable, is unable to change this conservatory rule that he's got over her, and she can't control her own life. It's quite remarkable. This Britney Spears story is baffling to me, I have to say. I can't understand, and I know there are legal sort of niceties about these kinds of things and how they're filed and when they're filed. But the idea that a 39-year-old woman who is of sound mind and is perfectly capable of looking after herself is somehow trapped in an agreement that she signed in 2008 with her own father seems baffling to me. I just can't understand why she can't get out of it.
Well, yes, read the headline this morning that the court has ruled that she has to make a formal application to court. She hasn't done that. She's given some testimony, but apparently this is a procedural thing. She's not made a formal application to court in order to have what in America appears to be called a conservatorship lifted. Yeah. For British listeners, it's probably better to explain it in terms of the phrase guardianship. Yeah. If you get letters from your school, your kid's school, very often you'll find parent or guardian, and you have to strike out. Most people obviously strike out guardian because they're the biological or adoptive or foster parents of the child. They're not the guardian. But guardianship is a very old legal regime, and it exists in a number of different contexts. You may, for example, have heard of a lasting power of attorney. Yeah. Now, and that used to be called an enduring power of attorney. Historically, an enduring power of attorney was what you had to do when Gran lost her marbles and couldn't manage her affairs anymore. Yes, normally you would expect it to be in the case of someone who can't look after themselves. Yes, and the modern lasting power of attorney, like Britney Spears' conservatorship, so you can see these laws have common roots. It's divided into finance and health, a modern lasting power of attorney. And it's clear with the original Britney Spears arrangement was like that. And in other areas too, and this can sometimes happen to a younger person, and in fact it's something I saw when I was in practice, was what's known as a spendthrift trust, which is particularly where often it used to happen historically, where a woman inherited a large estate, but it wasn't all for her. Some of it had to go to the children of the relationship. And what would happen was that the family, the man's family, typically would impose what was known as a spendthrift trust over her if it became clear that she was just buying diamond jewellery and fast cars or whatever, so to go over the top of her and manage her finances. So this is a relatively common historical phenomenon. It seems to have been applied in Britney Spears' case because she was at some point not of sound mind. However, it's interesting, and I've read into a little bit of the detail of it. One, the full document isn't available. So we've got the problem of, like the free trade agreement with the UK and Australia, of commenting on things we don't really know about. Yeah. And two, her father no longer looks after the personal or health side. Remember those two limbs, there are finance and personal and health. Someone else looks after the personal and health. Although she's saying that he still retains some control over some of her personal business. And she will have to make an application to court, and this will have to be ventilated at trial because he insists he's not there and hasn't been since the end of 2019, and there's a court records to that effect. One thing the court has approved is having her finances under the control not just of him, but also of an organisation called the Bessemer Trust, which they do things like manage people who have spendthrift trust problems. They are a proper wealth management firm, and that's what you're supposed to do. When you've got someone who runs through money like water, basically, then you have something like a wealth management firm to help them constrain their spending and manage their finances. Yes. But my point about it, Helen, is that it may well be that she required that sort of overseeing back in 2008. But I've never come across a contract that you couldn't get out of effectively. That if you even agreed at the time to sign it, surely now that you say, well, listen, I accept that I should have signed it and it was fine for a while, but now I want out of it. Surely she would normally be allowed to pay her way out of it, buy her way out of it. Well, this is the thing, a conservatorship or guardianship, it can look contractual, but it's not quite the same as the law of contract. I mean, it borrows from other elements. It borrows from family law. It borrows from the law of trusts, areas where you don't always have the same rules as with the rule of contract. You're seeing this in the Bill Cosby case. Yeah. It's the same thing. Bill Cosby gave up his right to silence, plead the fifth, and therefore provided evidence that allowed a significant civil claim to be brought against him. And he did so on the understanding that him giving up his right to silence and providing evidence would not be used against him in a criminal suit. Right. And the court has naturally interpreted that like a contractual agreement, and said that the prosecution in this case couldn't bring the case. They were stopped, that's the technical term, they were stopped from doing so precisely because he'd given up his right to silence, which is a constitutional right in the United States. So contract has this sort of very odd relationship with a lot of these other things. And I will say that one thing I do find alarming about the Britney Spears case, and I do want to see how this has come about, is she alleges that she has been deprived of the capacity to conceive a child.
Yeah.
Now, that might be just something peculiar and odd about American law. As I always say, I am a lawyer, but I am not an American lawyer.
Yeah.
But that does strike me as really quite alarming.
Yes, I think that's
and
absolutely right.
If it emerged in Britain, and I have never seen a case like this ever in the United Kingdom, maybe they exist, but I never saw one. Mind you, I wasn't a family practitioner. I did a little bit of family work in Scotland, but the Scottish system is very different. That strikes me as very odd and very alarming.
Yes.
And it too has really quite unpleasant historical roots.
Yes, it absolutely does. Listen, we've got to leave it there, Helen, because we're running late, but thank you for that very insightful compensation for my inability to figure out what is going on with the Britney Spears case, because it seems very odd to me indeed. Helen Dale, their writer, lawyer, political commentator.